Very good afternoon to you all. Welcome back from lunch. I hope you had a good one. We are going to move into the next session, and it is my pleasure to hand you over to John Mark Williams, the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Leadership, who's going to chair the discussion. John.
Thank you very much indeed. Welcome everybody to this afternoon session on SMEs driving growth. I have a very distinguished panel actually to chat with in just a moment. Before I talk to the panel, before I introduce the panel, I just want to make a couple of remarks, if I might, about SMEs generally, just to set the scene for our discussion. As most of you will be very well aware, SMEs are I suppose an under-recognised yet very important element of almost every country's economy. Very often they make up between 95 and 99% of the businesses in an economy. They will very often make up, is probably the right word, about 50% of the employment in some economies, and certainly close to 50% of national turnover of GDP in many economies. One of the things which is crucial about SMEs is the importance of recognising the difference, not just in size, but in scale between SMEs and enterprises. They have a different operating system, and I often say that large corporations, enterprises have a culture, SMEs have a personality, and that is often reflected in the way that they operate. So with that as a context, as a background, and particularly applicable to Commonwealth nations, many of which are small nations, let me introduce my panel, if I may, please. First of all, on my left, the Honourable Gemma Arias-Vasquez, MP, KC, Minister for Health, Care and Business in the Government of Gibraltar. And Gemma is a specialist in construction law and corporate law and was involved in drafting the Gibraltar Companies Act in 2014. So is very well versed in business, I think, really. Karim Engeh, Director, Investment and Portfolio Operations for Helios Investment Partners. Karim's a director within the investment team at Helios with a strategy focused on tech-enabled businesses across Africa. Next to Karim, I'm very pleased to introduce Lita, who is the relatively new Chief Executive of the Chamber of Commerce in Samoa. And I say relatively new since March, I think, Lita, yeah. And for a Chamber of Commerce Chief Executive, we hope that's just the start of your tenure. And last but by no means least, next to Lita, Nick, who is going to say a few words himself in just a moment. Nick is the Chief Commercial Officer for Royal Mail and is responsible for driving Royal Mail towards a future with e-commerce distribution at its heart while still retaining a very strong letters business. So please welcome the panel for our discussion. Thank you very much indeed. And Nick, if I may, I'd like to ask you to make a few remarks first and to set us up for this discussion.
Thank you very much. Afternoon, everybody. So I should say first, as it was just pointed out, and I wasn't going to say it, I work in a distribution company, and this is the day after Cyber Monday. It's 3 days after Black Friday. We are incredibly busy at the moment and dealing with probably every SME in the UK. So happy to answer any questions about that, but it feels very, very current today. So I always feel at these things that I ought to say a few words about why I probably understand something about SMEs on here. So what's my credentials to make any comments whatsoever? I work for Royal Mail. We have three primary brands, Royal Mail, Parcel Force in the UK, and then GLS that operate in about 35 countries across Europe and in North America. So a lot of countries we work in, mostly focusing on the SME market within each of those. Within the UK, we talk to all of the SMEs in the UK on a very regular basis. We survey what they want, what their barriers are, and we look to see what we can do to support their growth in the UK. In addition to, and I'll cover briefly what those barriers are and what we see as the answers to those, what's becoming more and more apparent for all of those SMEs is a real focus on sustainability. It's making a massive difference to them, and in terms of distribution, brings some unique challenges. So what are the barriers, particularly for distribution between other countries and within the Commonwealth? There's an obvious one. For SMEs, the complexity of exporting to multiple countries and all of the customs barriers they have in there, the new regulations about data transmission are really huge. They need some big help to make sure they can export successfully between those countries. The time to deliver, so if you are exporting directly individual items from one country to another, particularly if it's as a result of a consumer order, really important. It can take a long time, and consumers are very jealous of their time. They want items to be delivered very quickly. You also need to understand the domestic market in the place that you're exporting from, what is required there, as well as the peculiarities of the delivery market that you're talking to that the consumers will recognise. And again, that can be very complex across multiple countries. So what is the recipe that we can see multiple people, including us and all of our partners, are developing to respond to all of those barriers and challenges? So the first is to get around those peculiarities of each country, all of the administrations that you have to work through, all of the partners, the marketplaces in particular. You need someone who takes away the complexity of the IT connections that are required. This, in the past, would have been horrendously difficult, but these days, with API connections where you can solve those with a lot of effort going into it in one place and then give access to multiple SMEs around the world, that is becoming the clear solution to that barrier. In terms of data, many marketplaces, and I should say again, SMEs tend to push a lot of their traffic through big marketplaces, so Amazon, eBay in the UK, Alibaba in the Far East, those types of things. Their requirements of SMEs are based around the data they provide and the service they're giving to customers, and that provision of that data is really, really important. In terms of customs clearance, then online tools that allow people to navigate those rules, that find the right customs code to put in, the right form to produce, those are incredibly important to SMEs. And when they inevitably get it wrong, then systems which can update those things in flight and add that additional information in where necessary. In terms of convenience, and again, as we were saying, SMEs really broad church in here, but they often do many things. They're incredibly busy people. So 7-day-a-week provision of those services, working around when they want to work, very important. Services that match those marketplace requirements that we're talking about. Making sure they're low cost, because often they're operating at very low margins as well as low friction. And making sure there's clear visibility of all of that data. They need to know exactly where their items are at all times. In terms of green, and like I said, very, very important to many of these companies today and their customers, then we've done a few things and we can see many of our counterparts doing it in different countries. So first, we're now collecting from people at their home or at their work premises rather than asking them to bring that item into our network. That's really important. It cuts out a whole other trip. It is the most efficient, the greenest way to get items into those distribution networks. We offer green services, and so do many others. That can often mean it's a bit slower. But if you give a consumer the confidence around exactly when an item is going to be delivered, explain that. It might take another day, but that means it doesn't have to go on a plane. We can make sure the vehicle it's going on is entirely full. That is very important to that recipient. Inevitably, we're rolling out many electric vehicles, got a huge fleet of those in the UK now. And the uniqueness of posts around the world. We deliver about 75% of all of the parcels in the UK on foot. We're not driving between them in a vehicle. And on foot, the greenest way that you can do that. As part of that, for the last 10 years, Royal Mail's been recognised as the greenest major carrier in the world in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And that foot delivery is a big part of it. A few other things which, again, without entirely teaching you to suck eggs, HVO fuel, hydro-treated or heat-treated vegetable oil, making a real difference in distribution while the industries are looking at electrifying big vehicle fleets, which can't be done economically yet. Solar power, renewable energy going in, all of those contribute to enormous reduction targets to make sure that that distribution is going to be as green as it can be. And then a final point, because it did say this was starting comments and I feel like I might be monopolising. So the time it takes to distribute items, we have seen a real evolution in the way items are distributed around the world. For items coming from, in the UK at least, the Far East and increasingly India, about 50% of those items are stored in warehouses in that country. It makes economic sense to do that, but it takes longer for those items to get to the UK. If people are happy to wait, that's an ideal solution. The other 50% are moved in bulk distribution into this country. They are stored in domestic warehouses. We work with multiple 3PLs to do that, and then they can be distributed in a matter of hours for people who are buying the items in the UK. And providing that choice is really important to sustain that growth for SMEs around the world. And that, I think, is probably plenty of opening comments.
Nick, thank you very, very much indeed for that, for setting the scene for us there. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
A couple of points that we will pick up, I think, in the questions for all of the panel from there. Some of the things that stood out there for me were issues of regulation and the regulatory challenges for SMEs, who are less able than large corporates, of course, to spend the time and effort making sure that they are compliant with regulation, data complexity, use of platforms, and distribution efficiencies. All very, very important things which impact SMEs more than they do enterprises. Okay, if I can come to our panel then, if I may. Gemma, can I come to you first, please? I mentioned earlier on quite a lot of the states within the Commonwealth are smaller states. From the perspective of a smaller state, a smaller jurisdiction like Gibraltar, how do you ensure that you can provide access to larger markets for the SMEs operating from Gibraltar?
Right, so I think that what we are doing as a government in Gibraltar is ensuring access to larger markets. So ensuring that our SMEs in Gibraltar actually have access to the UK market. So there's an agreement for services with the UK market, and therefore we provide access into the UK market for insurance, for gaming, for financial services more generally. And it's all about working to align our regulatory environment in Gibraltar with that of the UK, so that it's a climate which businesses understand when they're entering the UK market. The benefit that you have in Gibraltar is the speed to market that you have. You have access to the regulator. You have access to people in a smaller frame than you would here in the UK, which enables you to get into the market quicker. So my own background and why I feel slightly qualified to talk about SMEs is that I was actually chair of the Federation of Small Businesses for 6 years before I became a minister. So to a large extent, I understand the issues that smaller businesses have, and how you cannot burden them too much with a regulatory burden, because they're usually smaller enterprises that do struggle. When you're placing upon them burdens, AML burdens, GDPR burdens, and all this regulatory regime. So what we are looking to do as a government in Gibraltar is, remove the red tape whilst aligning markets and ensuring that there's an understanding of what is fundamental for the markets to be able to talk to each other. So for the Gibraltar market and the UK market to be able to talk to each other and align themselves in a way which makes it acceptable for Gibraltar firms to operate in the UK, whilst at the same time maintaining a benchmark of what is required.
Excellent, excellent. And can I just a follow-up question, I suppose. Your position as a parliamentarian in Gibraltar, do you think that enables you to have a useful relationship with UK parliamentarians when it comes to aligning regulatory systems and things like this?
Absolutely. It's one of the things that I've only been in the job for 6 weeks.
Yes.
But it's one of the things that the government has been doing since, particularly since the Brexit referendum. So we are looking to align the services of the UK market so that there is an access point and an agreement between Gibraltar and the UK for Gibraltar to be able to access the UK market.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And just picking up on that services alignment in particular, I think, that affects Gibraltar quite so much. Karim, can I come to you with the next question? Because it's estimated that around 80% of the workforce across the African continent are employed by SMEs. As I mentioned earlier on, there's an enormous amount of SME, emphasis, I think, in the economies across Africa. Yet finance is still a challenge, despite the size of that as a marketplace. What can investors and entrepreneurs alike do to help minimise the challenges of SMEs accessing finance?
Yeah. Thank you, John. No, I think that's a really good and very topical question. Let me just start with a very simple statistic. If you take a country like Nigeria, which is one of the markets within which Helios, invests in and has been doing business for a long time, I think barely 30% of SMEs have ever had access to a loan from a financial institution. Okay, so it tells you really the gap and how underserved SMEs are. Now, for those who've had it, they'll tell you it's extremely expensive, nearly prohibitive, and for those who've not really succeeded or who may have even succeeded will tell you, banks will tend to ask for quite a lot of guarantees and, going through very complex processes to actually access or try to access finance. Now, I think it's really important to understand what most SMEs on the continent look like and how they function. So a lot of SMEs, unfortunately, are still, in terms of the business practices, tend to be very manual, tend to still do a lot of sort of pen and paper accounting and following up, their financial performance. And also there's limited distinction between the individual who created the company and his business, sometimes using a joint bank account. And there's a good reason why they do that, probably for, tax and compliance reasons. So within that framework, it's quite normal, I would say, for banks to not want to lend to SMEs because it's very risky. And also from a legal perspective, if your SME is not able to repay, it's quite difficult to actually get your money back. Now, so from my perspective, there are probably three or four things SMEs should really focus on. One is, I think, just general financial literacy and education. I think it sounds very simple and basic, probably in a Western and developed market context, but I think just having, first of all, the right financial statements, constant reporting, the right governance already positions the business as a very credible partner towards financial partners, and be them institutions or investors like us. So that's sort of, I would say, the real basics. Second is, in a world where technology is, just absolutely critical, it's pervasive across the whole society, there's a huge opportunity actually for SMEs on the continent to leverage technology in their day-to-day operations. A lot of operations are still in cash on the continent, unfortunately, and so if SMEs are able to leverage, online payments and manage the business through, using technology for their reporting, it would actually open them a world of financiers and companies ready to provide investment. So the good thing on the continent at the moment, what we're seeing as investors is a lot of startups really focusing on providing funding to SMEs. But for that to happen, they need to have traceability of the financial transactions and money flows of the business. And that you can really do really properly only if you're sort of digitized. We are invested, for example, in a company called Fauri in Egypt, which extends, loans to SMEs, working capital loans, supply chain financing loans, and they can only do that because they have access, visibility, and sort of semi-control as well on, the financial flows of those SMEs. And then the last point I would say really to help SMEs as they think about getting new funding is really not only focus on the bank financing. I think a lot of SMEs naturally when they think funding will say, oh, I have to go to the bank and get a loan. Makes sense? But actually for a lot of SMEs, given their level of maturity and the stage of development, bank financing is actually not the right, I would say, type of funding, and also just from a risk-reward perspective, the banks would struggle. So it's up to them to really think about other sources, venture capital financing, if the business is really more in the startup phase and showing high growth. At a later stage, obviously, private equity, preaching for my own chapel, obviously, we're always there to support. But really, it's this idea of don't always consider bank financing as a default option. Now, I understand there's a desire to keep control and ownership of the business, and that perception of potentially losing control is normal. But actually, I would encourage SMEs to read, and this is where our land is really encourage SMEs to think about alternative sources of capital as not only providing capital, but actually providing support in terms of governance, growth strategies, market expansion, and just really creating a credible partner alongside them to really go conquer more clients and then potentially actually access the bank financing which they may need.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Karim, and thank you for finishing on that point around alternative finance from banks, because of course there are other finances are available, other forms of finance. Lita, Karim just explored there some of the opportunities around financing for SMEs on a very large continent. Samoa, of course, is a very different animal in economic and geographical terms. What's the current landscape of SMEs in Samoa, and what are the key sectors where SMEs are making a significant impact in the Samoan economy?
Thank you, John. Just to put a context on the size of Samoa being a small island developing state. So Samoa has a population of just less than 200,000 people. It's a very tiny island compared to a lot of countries. And with that comes the challenges of a small scale of economy, very limited resources, and again, the geographical location, which is quite isolated. To answer that question, John, going back to the speech or remarks by our Prime Minister that was made yesterday morning, approximately 88% of Samoan businesses are SMEs. And these are the SMEs that are contributing, or the majority of it contributing to the economy of Samoa. Our economy depends largely on the micro, small, and medium enterprises in Samoa. Again, with the challenges, it's very difficult for a very small country to, particularly in this area of SMEs and private sector, to grow and thrive in a very restrictive environment. So what happens is the government and our development partners are the key for us at this stage to access assistance. I think it's a common challenge that I've heard across not just the Pacific region, but as well as our other SIDS countries from Caribbean and other regions, that the two main challenges that we face is capacity and funding, access to funding. So with this, the only alternative that we can look at as a small country is the assistance that we can leverage from our development partners, as well as government, which also again puts the pressure on government because they too need to look at how they can increase and mobilize our own domestic resources going forward. We all understand that development partners will eventually cease at some point in terms of granting grants to us, and then perhaps the other option will be lending, which again, it's very difficult for a small island developing state to look at these alternatives going forward. So the main key sectors, as again was mentioned yesterday by our Prime Ministers, predominantly agriculture, fisheries, industry and services, also known as our tourism sector, which contributes 20% of the GDP for us. It is one of our main earning sector because of our white beaches, blue seas, clear waters, and also manufacturing and retailing our emerging sectors in the private sector.
Interesting, and that 20% of GDP, there's a dependency there, which is a risk attached to it, of
High
course.
risk.
Yeah, and I'm sure that it's something the government is looking at.
Yes, it's a high risk because we are also very prone to natural disasters.
Yes.
And I think that's why it's very important for our businesses to also integrate climate and disaster risk in our own business plans, continuity plans. It's the work's ongoing, but it's still a challenge for smaller businesses. Again, you're looking at capacity funding. It needs an ongoing regular assistance for these smaller businesses. But that's the reality that we're faced.
That's the reality. That's absolutely right. Thank you very much for that. Nick, just picking up on the reality of, and I'll use the word isolation, if I may, in the context of some of the smaller states, particularly the Pacific states and things like this. Of course, you're in the business of logistics, and there's an old military saying that says amateurs talk about strategy, professionals talk about logistics. And it's probably particularly important, of course, for SMEs and things. How does Royal Mail ensure that its services remain both accessible and cost-effective for a wide range of SMEs, particularly those in remote or underserved areas?
So great. I talk all about strategy all the time. So I'm not sure what that is. So
present company accepted,
yeah,
then, of course.
So sometimes it's quite tough being realistic about it. Some things have got easier with the advent of IT that can talk across borders in a way that perhaps it would have historically been difficult to do on a either legal or language basis. So our strongest ties have taken investment from where we've seen the biggest flows. So again, this is in slightly reverse, saying that it creates some issues for smaller economies. However, the functionality that's put in is replicable and goes across everywhere. So, most things in the world are made in China or in countries surrounding it, and that's where we see the biggest flows. Of the items that come into the UK that are ordered as individual items, stuff coming direct from China is about 10% of it now. And items that come into warehouses and then get stored here, that's probably about 30%. That's meant that we've had to build interactions around the customs regulations, around connections into the relevant marketplaces, and that tends to be the best route. What we've found for smaller economies, smaller locations, is they tend to see SMEs linking into the same platforms. You're going to struggle to launch a platform that's specific to one country and then expect people around the world to go and log into it. But Alibaba has got many customers worldwide, same with Amazon, same with anything else. So linking up to those types of platforms is usually key. The other thing, which is true regardless of the geography, is it needs someone who is providing those local distribution links in that local geography. And typically that will be a 3PL who's operating around an airport, around a port, who is providing the ability for local SMEs to connect into them, potentially even giving them stock to store at that point, and then they will manage those links on their behalf. That tends to be the route we've seen. That started small in China, and now it's an enormous part of a worldwide economy. We've seen that move through India, many other places across the sort of Far and Near East. So that, I think, is the sort of demonstrated route, and how it becomes easier for SMEs not to have to spend all the money recreating that type of technology. The other part that I talk to is if it is something which has got a reasonable amount of volume sitting behind it. So you normally test with distributing items from the destination country. If you find a market where you're getting some orders, then store stuff in that market. And again, there are plenty of people out there who can operate on behalf of that. We talk to all of those. That tends to mean that you can export in bulk. You do a customs clearance once, and then it's distributed within that country. That's what we've seen developing. We are now talking to country by country, wherever we can put those types of connections in place.
Right, excellent, thank you. So what I'm picking up from that actually is one of the most important elements here, particularly from an SME perspective, is the first mile and the last mile,
Yep.
hooking into the logistics infrastructure that sits around the world.
Yep, absolutely.
Excellent, thank you. And you just mentioned one phrase you used there was exporting in bulk. And if I can come to you, Gemma, if I may, Gibraltar is the largest bunkering port in the Mediterranean. How do you, as a government, how do you balance that economic benefit that accrues to Gibraltar with sustainability in the environment?
Well, it's a balancing act, which we've actually tried to do in our recent manifesto. So 6 weeks ago, there were elections, and the manifesto contained numerous commitments to a green ports environment. It assists assists government, that industry is actually moving in this direction. So yes, it's true that we are one of the largest bunkering ports in the Mediterranean, but it's also true that industry is moving to different sorts of fuels. So for example, Gibraltar's seen the first 2 LNG fuel operations occurring in the past month. So we have barges that are built to manage those fueling operations, which are environmentally much better for the long term for Gibraltar. We're also very conscious of environmental incidents and the way that we manage environmental incidents relating to bunkering operations in the port and the response to it. So we've recently had an incident with a vessel called the OS-35, and the way that was dealt with by the port has actually been quite exemplary. There hasn't been any significant environmental consequences as a result of that, and it's all been because of the mitigation measures that we have in place, because of all these green port initiatives that we have in place, in order to mitigate any incident of this nature. So I think it's very important for governments to set an environment, a regulatory environment, where our aims and our sustainability aims come into play. So we've got a Climate Change Act which sets very clear net zero targets for the future. But it's very important for us to set those policies. But actually what we are finding is that it's actually industry which is driving those initiatives because of the pressures that they find themselves from their own customers and from their own suppliers. So we are moving in that direction with different infrastructure initiatives which the government is looking at to make all fueling operations far, far greener in the future.
Interesting. So there is a significant sustainability and environmental consideration as far as Gibraltar is concerned, partly, of course, because of the position of Gibraltar as the gateway to the Mediterranean.
Absolutely. And in terms of my own portfolios, what I've actually found is that when our Chief Minister gave me the portfolios, I was slightly overwhelmed by the different portfolios that I was given. But I've been given business, I've been given the port, and I've been given utilities. And actually, those 3 portfolios work very well together because, from a sustainability point of view, the utilities fit into that quite neatly because of the provision of future infrastructure for the port to be able to operate. So it's all about looking at, what does industry need? How can we support industry? What infrastructure do we need to support industry? And how do we regulate that environment so that it's as sustainable as possible?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lita. Lita, can I come back to you around this sustainability agenda? Of course, Samoa's unique geography and its position and its environmental characteristics actually offer both opportunities and challenges, I think, for SMEs in particular. How do SMEs leverage those aspects of Samoa's growth?
Thank you, John. I'll not look into challenges. I'm a very positive person, so I'd like to look at opportunities.
Good.
Again, we'd like to leverage our country's position in a way that we look at it. It's like an untapped paradise in the middle of nowhere. So how we can look at through promotion of, again, eco-tourism, because at the same time, we're conscious we need to develop, but at the same time conserve our environment because it's the only thing that's left with us. And we are, as a small SIDS country, very serious about the impacts as well of environmental and climate change because we are at the forefront of all of these impacts. So how we like to leverage is promoting ourselves as a potential investment place in the different areas, particularly tourism. Again, developing our tourism because it's the main revenue earner for the country, as well as leverage our, I suppose, security position. We are a very politically and economically stable country. If we look at our other neighboring countries in the Pacific, they've had their shares of coups and difficulties in establishing stability for businesses. So we're trying to leverage that position as a country to try and attract our potential investors. There's a lot of untapped resources as well that we can offer in terms of quality. We've had potential investors from Japan. We try and identify niche markets, noting again, it's a very small country with very small specific resources, natural resources. So we try and leverage by using quality as opposed to quantity. So I'll take an example. It's our coconut oil that's on the market. So we cannot compete with other larger economies and countries like Asia. But what we've been told is that we offer the quality. We have that quality oil that no other countries have. So we try and market that, leverage that as a potential area for us as a country to focus on very specific products or resources that we have to promote and address the issue of SMEs and how they can grow and thrive. Because again, looking inward, internal markets, very difficult. The only way for us is look overseas, partner up, or entice our foreign investors to come in and partner with our local companies.
Great. Just picking up on something that Karim mentioned earlier on, which was the idea of providing not just finance for SMEs, but actually other support services for SMEs. Do you think there's a role there for the Chamber of Commerce in supporting the development of SMEs from a marketing or operations or HR perspective?
Definitely. So our role, we are the policy arm for private sector in Samoa. So in my country, there are three main sectors or players for the whole national development. So there's a public sector, which is essentially government, private sector, which are the umbrella arm of private sector, and then we have civil society. Again, they have their umbrella body. It's called the Samoa Umbrella Body for NGOs. So these are the three main key players within government, and that's how I suppose we partner up with each other. So it's not a challenge at the moment for us compared to other countries in terms of partnership with governments, essentially, because again, that's where our source of assistance comes from, to build our capacity as the chamber, national private sector organization, to provide that service to all our business community. So that's essentially my role. I have to work for my money, go out there, look at all the opportunities that are available, including funding opportunities, negotiate with government, advocate, facilitate, coordinate everything, so that I'll be able to give this out to all our business community. So,
very interesting, actually, that idea of layering the capacity building, so building the capacity in the chamber to be able to build the capacity in the SMEs and things. Karim, can I pick up on that? Because is there a role there, do you think, for private equity and other equity funders to work with, say, with chambers of commerce, not just obviously in island nations like Samoa, but of course on the African continent, in other Commonwealth nations, as an alternative to banking finance?
Yeah, look, as a fund, we obviously invest in multiple countries, and there's always a variety of stakeholders, be them the employees, the selling shareholders, but also the government and the regulatory bodies. And we actually have someone internally at Helios focused specifically on engaging with regulatory bodies, because we think you have to work in partnership with the government and with the regulatory bodies to actually effect change and actually drive change. So yes, we actually see this partnership as pretty critical. How we work.
Interesting. So the three sources of finance potentially there for SMEs: government finance, call it equity finance, private equity finance. Is there a third set, which is supply chain finance? When we think about the position of SMEs within supply chains, very often it would benefit the major customer for those SMEs to be investing in those actually in that SME supply chain. Have any of you actually seen any evidence of large corporations willing to invest in their supply chain, their SMEs in the supply chain?
Very small for us.
And this is an unexpected question, by the way. I just thought of this one because I've seen only in a couple of sectors have I seen this. One was oil and gas, the other one was in construction. Neither of which actually are material in many of the states that we're talking about.
Also in the food and beverage industry, it's a very relevant one. So the main provider will often finance the bars and restaurants underneath it. So they will provide financing in that way.
Excellent. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think the FMCG industry as a whole on the continent, because it's serving obviously a really large retail network of pop and mom shops, actually serves as a catalyst in terms of the funding of those end mom and pop shops who would, coming back to the earlier question, would always cite access to capital as the key issue to growth and the key impediment to growth, and we've seen this in some of our businesses. So yes, and in the more larger economies, you actually have a really well-funded startups, driving supply chain finance, right down to the SMEs, and also, payments, which we'll talk about later. So a whole suite of services, which tends to really suit the needs of a lot of the SMEs, because they don't actually need very long-term, long tenor financing. They probably sometimes it's just working capital financing, which revolves quite quickly. And some of these players are really well suited in terms of how fast they can disburse the money to the mom and pop shops in 24 hours, 48 hours, which a regular bank would actually struggle to do. So it's really important, and we're seeing that.
And often the reimbursement is being tied into the products rather than actual repayment. So.
Exactly.
Right. This is very interesting. I remember, just as a quick aside, I was having a chat with the chairman of a very large corporation in Europe, an automotive company, and he said to me, this was about 8 or 9 years ago, he said to me, we have just made our first profit in Europe for 10 years. And I remember thinking, actually, how many SMEs could run at a loss for 10 years in any market? And it just illustrated for me the difference in culture between a large corporate and an SME. Do you think, all of you on the panel actually, do you think that culture, and we're thinking about banks and large financiers, do you think that culture is a barrier to SME development? Because not many large corporations actually have empathy with SMEs.
I think the reality of an SME and the reality of a businessman's day-to-day life is very different to that of a corporation, The businessman has to actually go out and buy the bottles of water, which is then going to give his clients. The businessman actually has to, it comes down to the whole operation with HR, everything. You don't have a HR department, you have an individual who's the managing director, who's also the HR director. So I think these realities are such that the more burden a government puts on these SMEs, the more the harder it makes it for that individual. No? So from a government perspective, it's very important to cut. We keep on saying these things like cutting red tape, and we use all these phrases repeatedly, but actually, it's about making it simple. So we need some form of regulation, but it's about making it as simple and limiting it to the absolute necessary regulation, so that you don't have reams and reams of forms, for example, which one person in the room will have to do in the cases of many SMEs.
Absolutely, very interesting. Nick, just picking up on the challenge of logistics for SMEs. Do organisations such as yourselves, and I'm thinking also of the platforms like Amazon or Alibaba or whatever, do you ever think about investing in the capability of SMEs to deliver, to produce and then deliver? Because they're actually your market.
So, yes and no, I guess is the answer. Yeah. So, just being, I don't know, real or cruel for a moment, the number of SMEs that we work with is enormous.
Yep.
So millions in the UK, tens of millions worldwide that we'd interact with. The number of those that go bust every year is absolutely huge.
Yep.
So as an investment case and the requirement to manage that across all of those, we don't tend to invest directly in those businesses. I have seen some examples, but not often. The primary point of investment tends to be finding common issues that SMEs have and then solving them at a single point.
Right.
So I've been to many events hosted by either us or by marketplaces typically, where you would tutor people on these are the types of problems that you're likely to encounter. These are the things which could drive you to go bust if you don't address them. These are the technologies that we've invested in which are open and free to you to use to help solve some of those problems, to try and encourage them to grow, because if they grow, then we all grow. So many examples of that around the world, but that tends to be where the investment goes.
Right, and just one last point on that, I think. The sort of class action issues, if you like, which affect very large numbers of SMEs, with which you and other platforms or other providers would want them to be more schooled in, do they tend to be almost basic business issues in terms of finance or operations or whatever? Because I ask because my experience of SMEs and my experience of being an SME on a number of occasions is that actually it's the basics of business which often form the biggest barrier to performance and growth of the SME. Is that fair, do you think? You're allowed to disagree, of course.
I'll disagree then. So you can see me thinking it. So typically we find SMEs know their market and what they need to do better than we do. So some of those basics, there is no general rule around that, and honestly, I'd feel a bit fraudulent if I stood in front of them and told them, make sure you've got enough money to pay your bills and those types.
Yep.
So what it tends to be is the high levels of complexity that are involved. So I hate acronyms, but I can't remember what API stands for, application protocol something. So these things where you can solve the really detailed connections that you need between financial institutions, between retailers, between logistics providers, those are incredibly complex. They cost millions of pounds to do, and it would be foolish to expect SMEs individually to go out and do those. So that tends to be the type of thing. It requires a room full of non-communicative IT people to go and develop these really complex things and then to push them out. And the real challenge is just making those intuitive and super simple. Mm-hmm. So what we've tended to do now is develop systems where it's super easy to plug into. So, for example, and I'll stop talking about marketplaces in a bit, but they are so endemic across our industry. If you sell something on one of the marketplaces, you can now just connect up with an API. It takes about 5 minutes to us and many other distribution providers, and it will drag all those orders out. You don't have to key it again. It will produce a label. It will produce the relevant customs documentation. It will do all that stuff in the background, and then it will just serve you up the details and the cache that's following it. That took us years to develop with people all around the world, and now you can integrate it really simply. So that tends to be where we've seen the investment move, and that is international. That can work in any jurisdiction.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I'm glad that you disagree, because disagreement is what makes a market.
Yep.
And it clearly indicates that my performance as an SME isn't quite up to scratch, probably. Lita, just picking up on the points that Nick was making there about the simplifying complexity, particularly in terms of access to distribution platforms and things like this. Is that a role where the Chamber of Commerce could work with SMEs in Samoa? Because the logistics, of course, is a challenge for Samoa.
Definitely. Like I mentioned earlier, this is where we come in to serve in whatever challenged area that our businesses face, whether it's within businesses, amongst businesses, or with government. Looking at all the areas like ease of doing business, then breaking that down to look at what specific challenges they're facing. And this is one of the areas as well. And looking at also the government side in terms of taxes and tariffs, of all these things, the various challenges that is hindering the development growth, whether it be internally between businesses or whether it's external to do with government. So our role, again, is very key in facilitating these challenges as well as opportunities, looking at the potential opportunities of whatever areas that can save costs
Yep.
for our businesses. So definitely.
Gemma, if I can ask, is that something that the government would want to engage with the Chamber in Gibraltar on that sort of thing as well?
Absolutely.
Supporting SMEs, yeah.
Absolutely. We have the Chamber of Commerce and we have the Federation of Small Businesses, and these are the discussions that we have on a monthly basis with them. It's about supporting them, about helping them through these issues. So yeah, it's clear that wherever you are on the planet, the issues that arise are very similar ones.
Are very similar ones, and the solutions actually are should be similar, I think, as well. Karim, do you work with chambers of commerce, trade associations, professional bodies in terms of supporting businesses in which you invest?
Well, yeah, because every single business lives within an ecosystem.
Yes. Yeah.
And so being good corporate citizens also implies engaging with, governments and Chamber of Commerce, trade associations. So we always make sure that we understand that regulatory framework, try and anticipate its evolution, because unfortunately also on the continent there's some level of volatility there. But for us, it is, the government a lot of times sets the agendas in a lot of our sectors.
Right.
And if you take a sector like the payments, which is, highly dynamic, that's an area where, a change in regulation can actually have massive consequences for any of our businesses. So we're extremely attentive, but we also try to partner with the government and trade associations to really stimulate a particular sector and really make sure it's top of mind and it's topical for the government. For example, we used to be invested in a business called Solevo, which I personally covered, and this is an agri-inputs business in Cameroon amongst other countries. And you had the Cameroon delegation earlier. And so, this is a business providing fertilizer to farmers. So absolutely critical for the economy, for the government, and in terms of exports, foreign currency in income. So with such a business, you don't have any choice than to really engage with the government to really make sure that, the needs of the business are taken into consideration. But also whatever you're doing is really aligned with the government strategy, and that's something which I think it's absolutely critical, and which we've done quite well, I think.
Interesting, and that word alignment seems to have come up quite a lot actually, both in terms of aligning, for example, Gibraltar's regulatory framework with that of the UK and other jurisdictions in order to facilitate export and certainly SME trade and investment, and also actually aligning I guess the capacity and capability of SMEs to that of the requirements of funders. Because I think clearly, of course, finance expects a return on investment, and SMEs are a risk, whatever that risk might be. We are not far off, about 7 minutes from the end of our session. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to make a final point, if I may. However, in order not to go to, because they weren't expecting this, you see, in order not to go to any of them immediately and catch them on the hoof, I'm going to make a couple of points that I have taken from this session, and then I'll come to the panelists to make a final point each, if I may. Some of the things that come out of it, I've got, and I'm sure you have, a great long list of points that have been made here, which are really, really important. A couple which are fundamental, I think, and I'm happy for panelists to disagree. First of all, it's the nature of the base economy in a country or in a jurisdiction. Is it basically manufacturing or services or agriculture, whatever? Because that will make a big difference to the nature of the SMEs in that country and the nature of the ecosystem of which they are a part. The role of government finance in the support of SMEs, which very often in small states or other small jurisdictions will be much more important than it might be in a larger economy, for example, where there is a much deeper infrastructure of finance, things like this. Regulatory alignment, capacity, technology. Nick, you mentioned technology before, as did you, Karim. The significance of that, particularly in the light of the way technology is developed, cannot be overestimated, I think. And then I'll call it sector dependency, and picking up on your point, Lita, about 20% of dependence on a particular sector for the economy. And I am sure that there are a number of economies around the Commonwealth which might not have quite that much, but will certainly be dependent, very large on one sector. So some of the points that I picked up there, panellists, can I ask each of you, I'll start with Nick, if I may, please, just to make a last point around SMEs and the Commonwealth.
In a fascinating way, thank you for chairing. It just struck me as we were talking through. So one, I've been doing this a long time, 30 years or so, talking to people around the world about logistics, and the world has, to some extent, become more complex. But the incredibly long-winded processes we had to go through to change regulation and paperwork and interactions at ports of exchange, etc., those have been replaced by a requirement to join up generally electronic communications to make those things easier. And that will have inevitably made it much easier for smaller states, island states, etc., to connect into those economies in a way that they wouldn't have done before. So more than happy to share any of those details with anyone who's interested in that.
Great, thank you.
The other piece is just thinking back as well to 30 years ago, then the people that I met overseas were all big companies. They were corporates like me, and they were that was how we were talking. Now we have routes to talk to SMEs around the world in a way that we never did before. So connecting up those smaller companies to open up enormous new markets around the world is orders of magnitude simpler now than it was before, and provided they get the right finance and everything else. So, so I think that's my takeaway from this piece is a degree of optimism that perhaps we've got a way to open up in a way that we wouldn't have done before.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that. And continuing the theme of optimism, which I know Lita will do.
Exactly.
Lita, do you want to make a last point on this?
Sure, John. I think for us, again, from the lenses of Pacific region, as well as SITS country, it's the way for us to look forward to on the various opportunities. Again, the challenges, we don't want to focus too much on the challenges, but look at opportunities where our Commonwealth family can assist, which is something I don't hear much throughout the 2 days, any lens that focuses on the Pacific and SITS country. I mean, if we're genuinely talking about Commonwealth as a family, we need to hear a lot more, see a lot more assistance from our bigger, we like to call it brothers and sisters, on how you can assist us, the little developing states, and how we can also help you. It's something that I've not seen much from a Pacific Island perspective in previous CHOCOM. So I think my concluding remarks is we look forward to the CHOCOM next week, where we will highlight Pacific region as well as SITS, but also other countries and brothers and sisters around the Commonwealth nation, highlighting SMEs. So we would like to put that as an official part of our program to bring voice from these smaller countries like ours into the overall program of our Commonwealth family. So
excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Both a proposition and a call to action there, I think. Karim.
Look, John, I think a lot of really positive thoughts have been shared, and maybe from my perspective, I think trying to remain very optimistic and very bullish as well. In terms of concluding thoughts, I would really say there's a huge opportunity, in my view, over the next couple of years to really stimulate growth of SMEs. And if you think about it from an African context for now, and then going further into other Commonwealth countries, with the African Continental Free Trade Zone, I think you have a huge opportunity for SMEs to actually work together, buy, sell, trade, transact. And I think that's something which, hoping that once regulatory, really come into place and are really active, hold huge opportunity. And with technology as well, obviously, payments are fluid, are easier. Anyone in Cameroon or Nigeria could buy coconut oil from Samoa with no problem. But so really what I'd really want to see develop even more, and it's already started to a certain extent, is having really well developed marketplaces, like the Amazon stuff on the continent, because that is really going to drive economic growth, employment, and for a continent like Africa with a huge and very dynamic young population, employment is critical. So drive growth, and yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Karim. And Gemma.
Thanks, John. I think from a government's perspective, what we can do is provide the environment, provide the regulatory environment, which is helpful to SMEs, which is not a burden on SMEs, to accelerate that growth. I think from a Commonwealth perspective, we also have to look at the wider picture. We've spoken about alignment. We've spoken about market alignment with the UK. I think it's about market alignment with other jurisdictions in the same way as we've done with the UK. So I think as governments, all we can do is provide the environment for that to be done, and then expect it to grow with industry leading it, which we always see happen, thankfully.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And I think the common theme there is about facilitating connections, whether it's connections between SMEs and each other, connections between SMEs and their supply chain, SMEs and government, etc. And that, of course, is actually the purpose of CWEIC, is to facilitate connections. This is why we are here today. And I think I'm going to end now with a small announcement, if I may, which is that the Institute of Leadership is partnering with CWEIC next year to present an SME Leadership Award for the Commonwealth. So we will have a Commonwealth Leadership Excellence Award for SMEs across the Commonwealth. We'll be piloting that next year. So I expect hundreds of thousands of entries from all around the Commonwealth. Okay. So I would very much like to thank my panel, the Honourable Gemma Arias-Vasquez, MP and KC, thank you very much indeed. Karim Engeh, thank you. Lita Louis and Nick Landon, thank you very much indeed, all of you, for your wisdom and your contributions. Please thank the panel.
And thank you very much, John. All right, it's time for the final break, but the show's not over yet. So we have 30 minutes. Then when we get back, we have one more session, and we have the closing ceremony. And you'll want to hang around for that one, because we're going to hear from the Lord Mayor of London and the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Anyway, for now, 30 minutes, stretch your legs, get some tea and coffee, and see you back here in half an hour.
Aye.